It's quiet out here now, but this clearing wasn't always like this. In November of 1965, this serene place was a killing field. This spot was one of the first places American soldiers collided head-on with North Vietnamese army forces. And within minutes of landing, units were being cut apart before they could even get organized. What was supposed to be a fairly routine mission during the Vietnam War turned into a fight for survival almost immediately.
They were a tough enemy, but we took them on, and when they wanted to attack, we cut them down.
The helicopters would arrive in a steady sequence, dropping men into a clearing that had only just begun to take shape as a position. Contact would come early, and it came from more than one direction. Units that were supposed to move out and establish ground found themselves engaged almost immediately, some of them before the full battalion had even dropped in. Joe Galloway was a war correspondent covering the war for United Press International. He arrived with one of the first groups and found himself under heavy enemy fire. Galloway stayed close to the group he had arrived with. He was moving when they moved, drawing fire from multiple directions. At the center of the landing zone, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore was already working to bring structure to something that had developed faster than expected. Moore, a West Point graduate, was commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and was responsible for holding the position as it formed under fire. One of Moore's first problems was trying to keep the battalion from being separated. One platoon had already moved far enough from the landing zone that it could no longer be reached directly. Attempts to close the distance ran into the same resistance that had formed the perimeter. Contact appearing before the gap could be covered, forcing units to pull back or shift direction. The North Vietnamese kept pressing, and small groups of American soldiers would be directed from one section to another, reinforcing where needed, then adjusting again as the focus changed. The closer the enemy got, the harder it became to use the firepower that had been meant to define the fight. Artillery and air support could still be called, but it had to be placed very carefully. By mid-afternoon, the platoon that had moved too far beyond the perimeter was still out there. They were still engaged with North Vietnamese forces, and they were taking casualties. By late afternoon, the position at X-ray had settled into something that could be recognized as a perimeter, and Joe Galloway remained near the center of it, watching the battle unfold. Moore continued efforts to reach the platoon that was cut off, but the ground between was growing more dangerous every minute. As darkness fell, the men held their ground. The separated platoon would have to endure the night on their own. The fighting continued throughout the night. Hal Moore didn't treat the morning as a reset. There was no assumption that the worst had passed. The line remained where it had been forced to hold, and every section still required attention. The same problems carried over: limited distance, shifting contact, no reserve to rely on. With visibility restored, supporting fire could be used more effectively. Artillery, which had been placed carefully through the night, began to be used with greater precision. Air support followed, striking positions that had been difficult to identify in the dark. That bombardment slowly began to ease the pressure. Galloway watched as positions began to change.
Good evening. Tonight we have reports from South Vietnam where U.S. forces are engaged in heavy fighting in the Central Highlands. The action is centered in the Ai Drang Valley at a landing zone identified as Landing Zone X-ray. Elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment were airlifted into the area beginning November 14th as part of a search and destroy operation. Shortly after landing, those units made contact with a large North Vietnamese force. The engagement developed rapidly. Troops arriving by helicopter were committed to the fight as they came in, with no opportunity to fully organize before encountering resistance. Fighting has been described as close and continuous, with enemy forces pressing from multiple directions. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore is commanding the American units on the ground and has established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone.
We took on a well-uniformed enemy. He was obviously well-disciplined. They had on proper uniforms, webbing, steel helmets in many cases, with camouflage netting, camouflage in them. They were armed with a variety of weapons from the Bloc countries, Russian and Chinese as well as the other Bloc country weapons. And they were good shots. They used fire and maneuver, and they were a tough enemy.
Reinforcements have continued to arrive under fire, expanding the position but also increasing the area that must be held. Reports from the field indicate that at least one platoon became separated from the main force during the initial stages of the battle. That unit was surrounded and remained in contact with enemy forces for an extended period. The platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant Henry Herrick, was killed early in the engagement. Command of the platoon was taken over by Sergeant Ernie Savage, who organized a defensive position and directed fire under difficult conditions. Support for that isolated unit has been limited to artillery, placed as close as possible to their position in order to prevent it from being overrun. As of the latest reports, efforts to reach the platoon are ongoing. Within the main position at Landing Zone X-Ray, American forces have held through repeated attacks, including overnight engagements. Artillery and air support have been used extensively, although close proximity to enemy forces has limited their effectiveness in some areas. The situation remains fluid. U.S. commanders report that the perimeter is holding, but the engagement is not yet concluded. Further updates will be provided as more information becomes available.
By the morning of the 16th, orders came down to begin movement out of the landing zone. The battalion would not stay fixed in place. It would move, linking up with other elements operating in the area. 79 U.S. soldiers were killed at X-Ray and 121 wounded, but the fighting was far from over. These men would be walking right into another brutal battle, where they would suffer even greater losses. Stay tuned.
Hello. We here at Battle Docs would like to extend our thanks to the people who watch our videos. I think it's important that we remember these men and women who sacrificed so much for our country. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. We'll see you on the next video.